What can I tell you about this board? I spent the better part of a couple hours setting it up, and I've kind of cracked a code, I think, in terms of spacing for Titanicus. So here's what I found. You've got pretty much three base sizes for Titans in the game. You got an 80 mil, you got the mid-range one. This is a Warbringer, but it's the same base as the Reaver. And finally, you got the Warlord. That's the biggest of the three. I think it's like a 90 millimeter by 120 millimeter. And that's kind of the problem. So if you look at all our spacing here between those buildings, between that big butte, what I've gone and done is I've spaced out the whole board's gaps to fit basically the Warlord. The reason for that is, well, it's a couple things. The Warlord is incredibly slow. It's not exactly the smallest model, but just to have it move forward pretty much in any situation without having to go sideways. It's only ever going 4 inches forward unless you boost it up to 6 inches. So it's already slow as molasses. Now, you don't have to move it a lot because it tends to be long range, but I found more or less if I went with that kind of spacing just everywhere on the board, it would allow this guy to move around, come to bear. The other problem is, in addition to only moving, 4 inches normally, he gets a single 45-degree turn. So even here, right, even just circumnavigating this, the guy would have to boost his locomotors there or stabilizers or whatever just to get extra turns. So what I found is, if I go ahead and I use basically 5 inches as a baseline, now his base is only about 4.7 inches wide, but if I just take a 5-inch blast template, for example, and I just use that as my baseline for all the gaps, pretty much any gap you can see on this board, it just flows a lot better. If you're newer to the game, the best way to describe how these Titans would circumnavigate the board, basically, I would call it bumper cars. They can only turn. This is the fastest of them. This is a Warhound. It can normally turn, I think, 3 times, and it normally moves about 8 inches. Now, as you can see, with a 5-inch spacing, he's not going to have a hard time being single file. He's not going to have a hard time being placed in most places. With the ruins here too, especially, you can see he has no problem fitting there. For example, grabbing some cover. So he's never going to have a problem, but as long as you make it easy for the Warlord, you're making it easy for all the other guys. The other reason I sort of chose this 5-inch spacing is when I go sideways with, let's take the Warlord again. When I go sideways with a Warlord, it's still, unfortunately, wider than the entirety of a Warhound's base. You can see the Warhound, 80 mil, Warlord is 90. So if I left a lot of gaps that were closer to the 80 mil base of the Warhound, it may lead to interesting ambush situations or just, places the Warlord can't go. But my fear is entirely boxing in a whole Warlord or a Warbringer or just some larger Titan unnecessarily. The game is very much about maneuvering as well, so I don't want to give it just to the Warhounds, let's say. What else can I tell you? If we focus back on the board, you've got 2 really big LOS blockers. You've got this butte here with a giant temple on it. That's mostly eye candy. It's not going to block a lot considering how high the butte already is. And then on the other side of the board, we have a second butte. Basically the same idea. Big castle, big crane on top. It's going to block a lot of the board and just make you go left or right. Same with that guy. Now, basically how we've gone and modified the rules for how we play in what's called the Engine War scenario, which is what we've been playing for Titanicus, is we have new rules for these ruins here. I think these are Troublemaker games. They're the same guys who make these awesome roads. So basically, the big solid GW buildings are impassable, indestructible. Can't move through them, can't move over them. We took out the stepping mechanic where normally in Titanicus, you can step over terrain that's like half your height or less. The weird thing about that is you end up stepping over like 5-inch terrain with a Warlord, so we basically nixed that. So Warlord still very much has to go around that solid GW terrain. But any of these ruins, a Warlord, a Warhound, Reaver, any Titan, can simply just to elect to walk right through. It doesn't even slow them down, so it wouldn't function as difficult terrain, but basically you would just move them right through where the ruin was. There is, however, one risky element to doing so. For every ruin you want to stomp through, you roll a d6, and on a 1 or 2, the Titan's legs takes 1 pip of armor damage. So in this case, if I rolled a d6 for this guy and got a 1 or 2, those legs would be taking immediate 1 armor pip damage. That's, not the biggest deal ever on a Titan that has a lot of armor, like a big Warlord. But if you're going to go mash up the legs on a Warhound, that might not end well if you're going to go stomp through half the ruins on the board. But the basic idea is, if you're trying to maneuver in a more direct way, or you're trying to maneuver like a couple Titans at the same time because of an activation, you don't have to let all of the terrain ruin your mobility. You can just stomp right through. In some instances here, like that ruin, that's actually 2 ruins, so that'd be 2 tests to knock at both. It might be risky, it might not. With only a 1/3 chance of hurting yourself, it really depends how risky you're feeling, but we like that risk reward, and I think in a game like this, I'd rather have Titans hurt themselves or risk hurting themselves than slow them down, because in a lot of instances, these bigger Titans are already very, very slow. So anyway, this is the board set up for the next game, very likely. Like I said, I feel like I've cracked the code a little bit in terms of spacing. It's taken a few test games to really figure out what works best. And yeah, you really just want to leave any of the Titan's bases a little bit of room to maneuver and turn. The game already has that problem where a lot of the bases are maybe as wide as the Titan at the highest point, but not really as wide as the legs. Especially on this end. Right now, if you just took the base away, it wouldn't have a problem sidestepping through a lot of smaller alleys, maybe even roads like that. But of course, the big, base saddle to the bottom, it makes it a little more difficult, and we kind of have to play ball with that. The last thing I discovered, this is sort of another thumbs up to, I think it's Troublemaker Games. If I take a Night Lancer, which is on a 50 mil, it just so happens to be the dimensions of these roads. So in an interesting gap like here, and that also ties into our rules for ruins, knights cannot stomp through ruins, but in this situation, that Night Lancer would have no problem fitting, right down that road, as you can see. So basically, yeah, with our rules that we've sort of rejiggled a little bit for the Engine War scenario, we basically just want Titans to have a little bit sort of different option set than Knights. One more thing I'll mention. The cover rules for Knights that we've come up with are kind of interesting. If, from the perspective of the Firer, you're only really seeing through the windows, so like the whole facing of the ruin covers the Knight will always get its full ion save. I forgot to make one more point. In addition to sort of cracking the nut in terms of spacing, right, where I discovered what I'll call the 5-inch rule for the gaps. The other thing I kind of discovered through the several games we've played and the different setups we've done is, I think most boards I'm going to stick with what I call, star patterns. So instead of going parallel to the board edges, right? So instead of all the roads basically being an exact grid, think like a hash mark on a phone or a number, whatever it's called. But basically, instead of being perfectly straight lines, right? I want it to be a star pattern going left or right. The reason being is you're allowed to move anywhere in your front arc, right? In your 45. It doesn't just have to be a straight line. It can be a bit left, a bit right. I even referenced the page there. So yeah, that's the basic idea. As you're moving forward, you're able to still sort of shift or shimmy left or right and flank. I think that's better than being a big Warlord boxed into a very specific road set. But yeah, check out the Engine War scenario. I'm going to throw a link down in the description of the video to the Engine War scenario. Oh, and I'm going to take this as a sign. So there's a spider dropping down from the ceiling right now. I'm trying to focus on it. I don't know if you can see it. But yeah, I was thinking of going with Iron Spider's Legio for my Legio, because I didn't have a name yet. And it was a cool Legio name I was looking up, so maybe I will. Anyway, thanks for watching. We're hoping to try and, if not get any more Titanicus battle reports, we're at least going to do more tactive videos and more breakdowns and more content for you. We're also hoping to do more modeling videos. We may be working on a new jungle theme board, so hopefully we'll have some more on that. But thanks for watching, and yeah, check out the Engine War scenario for Titanicus. It's a great way of getting into the game. Cheers.
Gods of war, may your hammer be mighty.